Welcome, everyone. We'll start in a moment. We'll start in a moment. Thank you for your patience. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Goldbert, Executive Director at the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley Law. Thank you for joining us for this special webinar entitled Radical Pragmatism, A New Approach to Peace in an Endless War. Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, Resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and Director of Realign for Palestine, will join Masua Sagiv, Senior Fellow at the Helen Diller Institute and Senior Faculty at the Shalom Hartman Institute, for a conversation exploring pragmatic solutions to the fragile ceasefire and assuming the ceasefire holds in the aftermath of the Israel-Hamas war. It feels important to connect the theme of today's conversation to real-world events, and I know our speakers will address a number of related topics. We have witnessed a ceasefire, the return of the living hostages to Israel, an exchange of Palestinian prisoners, the painful dragged-out return of the bodies of hostages, and ongoing violations to the ceasefire. The current peace feels fragile, volatile, and hopeful. With so much hate and distrust, so much devastation and despair, how do we even begin to imagine what peace could and should look like? Today's conversation could not be more timely. The Helen Diller Institute provides a rich academic forum for students and faculty through its two programs, one in Israel Studies and the other on Jewish law, thought, and identity. The Institute houses an undergraduate fellowship of 40 students, brings visiting faculty from Israeli and U.S. universities to teach and research at UC Berkeley, hosts the university's undergraduate minor in Israel Studies, and offers dozens of lectures and programs for the public and campus communities. Please refer to our website, social media, and our email blast for upcoming programs and for recordings of past programs. All of the programs, activities, and events of our institute are dependent on philanthropic support from the community. We thank you for your continued support. I'm happy now to introduce you to our speakers. Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib leads Realign for Palestine, an Atlantic Council project that challenges entrenched narratives in the Israel and Palestine discourse and develops a new policy framework for rejuvenated pro-Palestinian advocacy. Realign for Palestine aims to cultivate a new generation of Palestinian voices committed to a two-nation solution, nonviolence, and radical pragmatism. Alkhatib serves as a resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs, including the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative and the Rafik Hariri Center, where he writes extensively on Gaza's political and humanitarian affairs, is an outspoken critic of Hamas, and promotes a radically pragmatic approach to peace and Palestinian statehood as the only path forward between Palestinians and Israelis. His writing and opinions have been published and featured across the U.S., Israeli, and international press, and his views are prominently featured across social media platforms. Al-Khatib holds a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in intelligence and national security studies. He grew up in Gaza City and left Gaza in 2005 to attend college in the United States as an exchange student. Much of Ahmed's experience is influenced by having grown up in Gaza during the Oslo peace process and during the difficulties resulting from Oslo's failure and the rise of Hamas and Islamism in Gaza. Since the October 7th massacre, Al-Khatib's life has been deeply impacted by the loss of 33 of his immediate and extended family members, who were killed by 3 different Israeli airstrikes. Still, he aims to play a part in breaking the cycle of dehumanization and defying the cycle of hatred, incitement, violence, and revenge. Now I turn to Masua Sagiv, who will moderate this discussion. I am pleased to welcome her back. Masua Sagiv is a senior fellow at the Helen Diller Institute and senior faculty at the Shalom Hartman Institute. She was formerly the 2021 to 2025 Koret Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at the Helen Diller Institute. Her scholarly work focuses on the development of contemporary Judaism in Israel as a culture, religion, nationality, and as part of Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state. Her research explores the role of law, state actors, and civil society organizations in promoting social change across diverse issues: shared society, religion and gender, religion and state, and Jewish peoplehood. Prior to arriving in the Bay Area, Masua Sagiv was the academic director at the Menomatan Center for Jewish and Democratic Law at Bar-Ilan University. She earned her doctorate in law from Tel Aviv University, where she wrote her dissertation on the topic of law and social change in the halakhic feminist struggle in Israel. After 4 years visiting at UC Berkeley with the Helen Diller Institute, she has now returned to Israel, where she continues her work with the Shalom Hartman Institute. So please join me now in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is such a privilege, Ahmed, to be in conversation with you. We've had two opportunities to sit and converse in front of different crowds, and we're very happy. I think you're happy too, to have this conversation within the constraints of the University of UC Berkeley. Um, it was Rebecca, thank you for your introduction. Even some of the words in your introduction, I feel, are so which terms we are using right now in a time that is a time of transition and in a time that is in very, very fragile. Can we speak about peace at all? What is this limbo almost that we are in? I hope we'll manage to touch upon this subject too. But Ahmed, can you start us off with what is currently happening in Gaza? What is the situation right now? How do you see it? How do you see the situation that we're at right now and looking forward to the future?
Certainly. Well, thanks again, everybody, and delighted to be here. And just real briefly about your comment on can we speak about peace right now? And nobody wants to talk about it. I get it. That's like the process and the peace and the politics, etc. But you know who actually speaks about peace, even if they use different words to describe it, is virtually everyone that I speak to in Gaza. Everybody in Gaza after 2 years of war, they're like, we want peace, we want stability, we want transformation. This isn't some esoteric concept. You know, that peace has for so many, it means different things to different people. Some people, it means the absence of war. For some people, it means tolerance and coexistence. For others, it means the ability to build and to share and to create. But never actually I encourage us all to not miss the point that ultimately we should all be in pursuit of peace. This was something that I was so disgusted by during some of the demonstrations during the war, of those who proclaimed to be pro-Palestine, and they would be like, "No, peace is a white man's word. Ours is resistance. No, always resistance." And it's like, I'm sorry, have you not greeted a Muslim in your life when they start with "Salamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh"? I mean, peace is in every social interaction, in every prayer, in every context. And so I say that, and I really means a lot to me, because that to me is the compass that drives my efforts and should drive all of our work. And peace isn't, the dialogue groups. It isn't just these abstract ideas. So I just wanted to make sure we normalize peace,
Yes. So we
normalize
have a
talking about
very, very clear North Star, right? Which is peace. And
precisely.
by the way, I think even the fact that we've started speaking about peace is something that we didn't do for a long, long time. It's interesting that the person who introduced peace is, I don't know if anyone thought it would be President Trump who would be the person who really, really pushes at least the language. Maybe we'll talk later about this, but can you bring us in as much as you can
Certainly.
what's going on right now in Gaza when we are almost 1 month after the sign of the ceasefire?
Certainly, certainly. So I will start this. There's multiple threads, but I'll try to be very brief. There is starting with the issue of the entry of humanitarian items and goods into Gaza. And so one of the things that's been positive is that we have seen an improvement, not in the amount of trucks that are going into Gaza. Now, there's a lot of a back and forth, if you will, on how many trucks are going in, how many are we dealing with, how many are supposed to be there going in daily per the agreement. But the takeaway is that overall there's a marked and a substantial improvement in the number of trucks going in. There's also another thing that's happening, which is very noteworthy, and that is the type of trucks. There are two types of trucks going in. There's the ones carrying humanitarian goods and supplies and items, and that is World Food Program, the United Nations, United Arab Emirates, Egyptian Red Crescent, medical supplies, boxes of food, flour bags, these essentials that just sustain people who are displaced, or just needing an acute uh, just acute nutrition, right? On the
Mhm.
other hand, we have commercial goods, and that is the items that are sold in Gaza by business men, by shops, by stores, by those who are able to pay for items. They buy them from Israeli businesses. They buy them from Jordan. They'll buy them from Egypt and from other suppliers, but they all come through Kerem Shalom as well. Now, this latter category is significant because, unfortunately, I mean, this is how you get soap and clothing and little batteries and like everything you can imagine. That's not just food and medicine. Um, this category is how Hamas is making its money right now. It's taxing a lot of those goods. Sometimes it's 30%, sometimes it's 50%. And so that either increases prices or that puts a lot of pressure on some of these merchants to acquiesce to Hamas's demands. It's all being done through the Ministry of Economy. Ministry of Economy is Hamas's vehicle for collecting a lot of these taxes. Then you have the separation in Gaza of East Gaza and West Gaza, with the overwhelming majority, almost 99% of Gaza's population, living in West Gaza, which is where within the yellow zone, the yellow line. And that's communities that are controlled by Hamas, communities in Gaza City, Nusayrat, Deir el-Balah, and Khan Yunis. There's no access to Rafah yet in southern Gaza.
Mhm.
And so we've seen the movement of some people from the south back up north to what remains of their homes. I was just talking yesterday even to a Christian family that has been holed up in a church, and they left the church where they were they were sheltering, and they're like a part of their home is still standing, and so they're staying in their home. We've seen some sigh of relief and improvements in terms of just people moving and picking up the pieces and trying to just find any space and capacity for restoring life. It's harsh, it's hard. There's still thousands of bodies that are believed to be under the rubble. Of course, that there's relief that the hostages have been released so that at least we can begin to think about, what does Gaza's future look like? However, there's a broad atmosphere of demoralization. Hamas is back in control. Hamas is interrogating people that it suspects of being traitors. I've had some friends of mine that have been taken to interrogation centers in hospitals right now, which is atrocious and horrendous. And I've known about this during the war, and I've really struggled in communicating this publicly because you don't want to be seen that you're telling Israel to, it's not that Israel's waiting for me anyway to do anything, but like, truth of the matter is that Hamas did abuse access to humanitarian facilities, and that needs to be addressed and laid bare to protect the civilians, to protect the people of Gaza, to rob the Israeli government of the ability to use that as a pretext to harm civilians. And then you have the issue of the lack of connectivity through in terms of travel. So there was a hope that the border with Gaza, with Egypt rather, would be open. And that has not happened. That has not occurred for a variety of reasons. The gap between phase 1 and phase 2 is widening. And with it are hopes for any substantial transformation. Right now, there's a UN Security Council resolution that's circulating. I've been seeing the drafts. And the main issue is that you have two schools of thoughts that have emerged in Gaza right now. You have one that believes that that you need a political process for disarmament and de-radicalization to take place. And that's a school of thought that the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the Qataris and the Turks subscribe to. And we've seen efforts trying to promote the establishment of a technocratic committee, et cetera, and that you need to bring back the Palestinian Authority, and the world needs to be supporting the Palestinian Authority in regaining Gaza. Then there's another school of thought that's emerging, and that's the United States, Israel, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others. And I'll be honest with you, I'm much more into that camp at a personal level, which is that there can be which thinks and believes that there can be no credible political process while disarmament has not really taken place. That if there's still Hamas and others have the weaponry and the tunnels and they wield the influence, they're going to sabotage the political process. They're going to set it back. They're going to hamstring and really decapitate the ability to impose new rules that really transform Gaza, that create a new professional political class. And then finally, what I will mention is there's this big uncertainty of what to do with the International Stabilization Force. And I've spoken to senior Arab and Western officials, and even those who are promoting the force publicly are themselves very skeptical of the fact that it could ever actually work. Because at this point, we've had, the Egyptians, the king of Jordan 2 weeks ago. Last week, it was the Azeris from Azerbaijan saying that they're not going to go into Gaza and take on Hamas. They're not going to go and fight Hamas. But you also need to figure out a way to take on Hamas, basically. And like there have been ideas that have been circulated, including even the use of private military contractors as a kind of like the tip of the spear for the force. They go in small increments, maybe they clear the area and then turn it over to the International Stabilization Force that can hold and clear, etc. And then very last point I want to make is that there's also two schools of thoughts, competing schools of thoughts that have emerged, as far as one that believes we should pragmatically do something with the part of Gaza that is beyond the yellow line, that is under Israeli control, where theoretically Hamas is not present, and try to develop it, try to clear it, try to kind of reestablish life there. And that is somewhat the Kushner, Witkoff, and Israeli school of thought, but is heavily opposed by the Saudis and the Emiratis and others. And then there are those who believe that we shouldn't put a penny into Gaza until we figure this whole thing out. I mean, Gaza's already tiny as is. And this idea of hyper compartmentalization of an already small territory is folly. And a lot of the Arab countries and some of the European donor nations are very skeptical about doing that. So there's a sense of stalemate. there's a sense that we can pass this resolution at the UN Council, but it's not going to go anywhere.
Mhm.
And then all bets are off. I mean, we could see a stagnation. We could see Israel um, go back and re-engage in some targeted military assaults. We could see Hamas trying to get some nations want to consider recycling Hamas into a security force on a temporary basis. And so there's lots of uncertainty, and it's kind of sadly a very dark, short-term, grim assessment for where Gaza's at and where it's heading.
So just one small point to be clear. The majority of Gazans are with under Hamas's control,
Yes, that is west of the
west
yellow.
west of the yellow line. Do you have any um idea to tell us about how much of the population or what percentage of the population is in the west and what in east?
I mean, there really is
Approximation?
virtually zero in the East, except for
Yeah.
some of the families that
Mm-hmm.
belong to these anti-Hamas militias. There's
Yeah.
four of these anti-Hamas militias, and
Yeah.
so with the biggest concentration of people being in the south near the Abu Shabab area, by
Mm-hmm.
that's the biggest of the anti-Hamas groups near the Kerm Shalom crossing, but we're talking about really small numbers. I mean, I don't have precise numbers, but we're talking
Yeah.
about a thousand at most
Yeah. Okay,
versus
so
an estimated 2 million.
so you touched on a lot of points, and I wanna pick some of them and to try to find a few threads to ask you some questions. First of all, maybe is the sort of the internationalization of the conflict and of Gaza in general is something that is a thread, but it's not just making Gaza and the conflict international, it's who exactly among the international actors who will lead, who will take the lead. And there are several, you've mentioned several schools, right? Or several approaches. You have Egypt and you have the Emirates and you have the Saudis. You didn't mention Qatar and Turkey, which I would love for you to speak about. But before we get to the actual actors who play the part, um, what does it mean for Palestinians on the ground that Gaza and the conflict are internationalized? And you've mentioned a sense of relief in Gaza among Palestinians that the hostages are out because maybe then something will be able to move and the difference between stage one and stage two. Israel is arguing that stage one is just not done yet because there are still four more hostages that are not alive, unfortunately, but four more hostages that are still um, that has still not been returned. And there are some polls. It's difficult to really get um, um, a reliable presentation of the situation for people who are outsiders like me and like us, like a lot of us. Um, but there are polls that definitely say that there is, if not a majority, but a large sum of people who are still supporting resistance, still supporting the solution for the conflict will only be through violent resistance. And you could say, A could be a lie because we don't know who's doing these polling. Some of them we do, and I don't know how reliable they are. And you can also say they're under totalitarian regime and they can speak. So my question is though, can this situation be solved without Palestinians on the ground? Or what is the role of Palestinians on the ground, and um, how do you deal with the fact that Hamas is in control? Hamas is back in control. There are different trends among the public, and there are a lot of international actors who are putting their hands in this. Can this work without Palestinians?
So, I mean, the short answer is yes and no. But let's start from the very beginning, from the end rather. I mean, if I get why folks rightfully bring up the issue of the polls, but I've addressed it ad nauseum in the sense that, you know, it's like imagine being in Russia or in North Korea and being asked about, you know, the environment or Kim Jong-un's use of missiles, etc. Now, is there a population and is there a component of the population in Gaza that supports Hamas? Absolutely. Does but I have been very clear that if you've lost your loved ones, if you've lost your livelihood, if you've lost your business, if you've lost, you know, what you hold dear to you, if you're in a long, dirty bath line to use a bathroom, if you are using a tent to shelter yourself and your family, if you can't have a shower except once a week, and that's if you're lucky, you're not standing there or sitting there and going like, wow, Hamas is been really did us a solid. October 7th was really successful. And by the way, that's not just in terms of the consequences of October 7th. I'm talking about people are not stupid. They're looking at the totality of the last 2 decades since the 2005 disengagement, 2006 Hamas elections and the abduction of Gilad Shalit that began the blockade, and then the 2007 takeover that really intensified the blockade. And they're thinking like tens of billions of aid dollars and reconstruction money, tens of thousands of lives have been wasted for absolutely nothing. And so, yes, like people look at that, at the totality of that picture and go, wow, like that has been a disaster. Like we should not keep doing that. And so you also have to take into consideration the fact that half of Gaza's population has only effectively known Hamas and known, like, you know, under 18 and only known life as part of, like, you know, an aid dependent territory that requires intervention by the outside community. And so though there are layers of support for Hamas, just so there is layers of opposition to Hamas. And I've been very adamant that the majority of the people in Gaza oppose Hamas. Now, that doesn't mean they're all ready for peace or coexistence with Israel. That opposition to Hamas does not equate to being Zionists or being pro-Israel, okay? And it's a step in the process of transformation, the process of changing the reality. So and by the way, the IDF itself, if you choose to believe the IDF, which I know a lot of people do, the IDF itself, the Israeli military, found documents in Gaza that showed how Hamas has manipulated this Khalil Shkaki's polls by massive numbers, like substantial margins. And you would think that the IDF would actually have incentive to show Gazans as all being Hamas and all being this and that. But to their credit, they're like, no, here's the documents and here's this and here's that. So make of that what you will. Going back to the internationalization of Gaza and actually building upon this sentiment, there is anger with both Hamas and Fatah. There, of course, there's fury and rage towards Israel, but I am choosing to often focus on Palestinians internally, and that is a gap in the discourse and in the discussion in the diaspora in particular. So I speak often with a focus on the Palestinians internally, because some people just they can't really handle that. They're like, Ahmed, you barely mention Israel. You barely mention Israel. It's all about it, and it's like absolutely not. I acknowledge the imbalance of power dynamics with Israel way up here and Palestinians down here. But believe it or not, within said imbalance of dynamics, there actually exists plenty of space for Palestinian agency, responsibility, and kind of like self rule and action. And that's not blaming the victims. That's not being self-hating. That is like the first step to empowering the Palestinian people. And I don't know when it became the norm to just say the Palestinians are perpetual victims and they can do no wrong. That is to say that October 7th was not an inevitability. It was a choice. And people in Gaza recognize it as a choice by Hamas, not by them, by Hamas, and not even Hamas. It was a small choice by Sinwar and Deif, two psychopaths that robbed the Palestinian people of their hope and their future. And so then you have Fatah that has failed miserably in a variety of arenas. They suppress in the Palestinian Authority. I mean, well, what is corruption when you hear about corruption? It's not just a dude siphoning off a bunch of contract money. Corruption is suppressing rising generations of Palestinian diplomats, statesmen and women, journalists, academics, business people. It's taxing people. It's operating like a mafia. They might not be like Hamas. Hamas is like literally going around with AKs and they're like, you're going to pay us taxes or else we're going to kill you. These guys, they're like, oh yeah, well, if you're not going to pay us, we're not going to give you this permit, blah, 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 blah. So it's two different regimes, same outcome, which is more internal kind of repression of the Palestinian people's ability to rise and perform and shine and do well. Of course, Israel is a player in that. You can't fully isolate Israel out of that. But there's plenty of margin to look at this and say, this is something that that elements of Palestinian leadership can address internally. So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is to say that there actually is widespread appetite for Palestinians to have the international community come in and basically professionalize the administration of Gaza, the administration of reconstruction and aid. And that does not mean the Palestinians just want to be perpetually, governed by someone else. But that is to say there needs to be a transitional period and no one can really assign a duration to how long said period can last.
Yeah.
But I have personally and in numerous settings, including right here, when you see all those planes here on this wall, 10 years ago, I tried to establish an internationally run Israeli approved airfield in Gaza. And there was overwhelming support for it being internationally run because people said Hamas or Fatah would screw it up. They would get it destroyed, they would get it ruined. And so now, 10 years later, and tens of thousands, 70,000 Palestinians lost later, Gaza's in it just shattered. There's willingness to accept that. The problem is, then we start going back to some of the points I brought up earlier. You can't have international intervention that is just about writing the checks. The international intervention has to be intricately involved in the process of de-radicalization, in some of the societal outlooks, in kind of some of the conflict resolutions internally within the Palestinian society, because there's a lot of internal societal conflict, but also as it relates to the conflict with Israel and the resolution there. Then you also have the issue of authority, monopoly on the use of force, and legitimacy. And so people are at different layers of where they're at. Some people they just want basic services and power and electricity and water and reconstruction to be run by the international community. Some people they're like, just get Hamas and Fatah out of our lives for a few years and let us organically come up with a new non-binary system of governance that's not either Hamas or Fatah. So that's where I think there's actually a window of opportunity for a lot of international engagement. Let's not call it intervention. Let's call it engagement in Gaza that isn't part of the typical NGO aid industrial complex that I think has actually been part of the problem. And by the way, like my dad ran an UNRWA clinic in northern Gaza. My brother is in Gaza right now. He's a field director for a major organization. I have a lot of friends in the NGO community. I'm not demonizing them. They're doing wonderful work. I'm simply saying that if you step back from the tactical component of the NGO world, they actually indirectly, particularly UNRWA and the UN and just they allowed Hamas to be able to say, oh, okay, yeah, you international community and the UN, you take care of our people, and we will just keep our money from Iran and Qatar and taxation to
And
ourselves.
our weapons, of course.
Precisely, precisely.
So what would be, so who should and shouldn't be the actors that would take part in this process? And I think I really appreciate the fact that you distinguish between a process of only taking care of the food and the supply, and or in um like the building of, it's really it's autonomy building, state building, agency building, like something that is
Nation
much
building.
more nation building. Yes, you know, and I really remember this last time we sat together. You told me that that you think the Palestinians need a Ben Gurion. They don't need resistance. They don't need they need the nation builders.
Mm-hmm.
So I get that there is an approach that says, and it seems like you support it, that we need actors from the international community to be that, or to at least initiate or platform or lead the way there. Who do you think should and shouldn't be those actors? And you mentioned some. We have so many hands that have specific interests that might, and I'm saying it carefully, maybe you'll say it less carefully, that might not only be interested in the well-being of Palestinians and in the well-being of Israelis and Palestinians, and in general don't really care about Israel Palestine, but maybe care about different issues. um and so we have the Egypt and Jordan and the Saudis and the Emirates and Turkey and Qatar and the West, right? And or different sides within the West, even in the US, the Democrats versus the Republicans. Who would you really want to see leading this effort, and who are you concerned leading this effort?
Well, I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily one nation or one entity
Yeah,
leading the effort. I mean, one thing that I wanted to mention earlier, to tie to the earlier question, I'll come back to this. Like,
yeah,
you do need like a basis of, even if they're not fully formed, even if they're not, you need some Palestinians to be involved in the process.
yeah.
And those Palestinians are going to interface with the outside world. They're going to hopefully inspire a new generation of a political class, if you will, in Gaza. And so that's entirely feasible and possible to do. The other thing that you need is that you have to have like safety for intellectually risky ideas, like people who want to think out of the box, to break the taboos, to really truly transform Palestinian society, which has unfortunately, like many societies of, I mean, I've experienced this with a lot of Arab and Muslim Americans. There is a high degree of enforced conformity and forced cohesion uh, around certain issues, and I mean, a lot of different cultures suffer from this, generally speaking. But in our society, we have a particular tendency for that I think we need to be able to shed. So going back to who should be involved,
Mhm.
I think some of the older players that were involved before and leading up to October 7th should not be involved in this. That's an easier starting point. And what do I mean by that? I think players like Qatar, for example, they're very helpful and were helpful in interfacing with Hamas. But this idea that they might be attempting to recycle elements of Hamas into a new security apparatus, this idea that they might be interested in basically underwriting Gaza's reconstruction on their own. Um, People like UNRWA, for example, with their massive, and by the way, I'm not talking about the entire elimination of UNRWA, but UNRWA over, like, basically growing to be this dominant massive monopoly over aid and over humanitarian activities in the Gaza Strip, I think it was just too big. It was too easy to infiltrate for Hamas, too easy to abuse, and it was not immune to like there was an incentive structure for UNRWA to sustain itself that didn't want to challenge Hamas or the infrastructure. It saw itself as basically being a provider, but it basically became a parallel government, a parallel universe, a parallel apparatus. And I think that was a mistake to let UNRWA grow out of control in the way that it did. I think Turkey is maybe helpful in very tactical spaces, but I worry about some of the rhetoric that we've seen over the years, some of the overt support for the Muslim Brotherhood, some of the overt support for hosting Hamas members in there. And so if we want a new Gaza that does not replicate what was there on or before October 6th, then I don't think some of these players should actually be involved. As far as the others, I think I look to the United States, that everybody in the world, regardless of how much money the US provides, everybody in the world wants the US to have a leadership role in marshaling all the nations, if you will, and convening everybody. The Saudis, particularly through the prism of normalization, if that ever happens, are very critical players in this. But also, I'm looking at the Emiratis, who are providing 42 to 45% of all aid to the Gaza Strip up to this point, and thinking they should have a role with their successful models of de-radicalization, with their successful, they come with a lot of baggage, just as every nation does. But those are the kinds of innovative players, like the Emiratis taking the risk on the Abraham Accords. Now, again, I want to highlight, I feel like we need to just keep mentioning this for those who are still with us. I am specifically talking about through the prism of Palestinians from an internal perspective, rather than, yes, Israel is a big player in this, and Israel has, there are a lot of pieces in which the current government in Israel, the rightward trajectory in Israel, and all sorts of factors and players are need to also shift for some of what I'm mentioning to work. But I think you have enough interest in transforming Gaza. The problem right now is that the Saudis and the Emiratis, they're angry. They feel sidelined. The Qataris and the Turks were brought in by the administration, and they're running the phase one. They ran phase one. And okay, that's fine. That's great. They got the hostages out. Like I said earlier, people wanted the hostages out because they actually, Gazans felt that Hamas was being reckless with their lives while the hostages were, because, Hamas didn't care about their lives. It cared about the hostages. So there's a belief that maybe Hamas will be modestly less reckless now, having lost its chief leverage, which was the living and deceased hostages. So I think there's a lot to be done with some of the players. My worry, however, is that it's great that we were able to deploy a business mindset to deal making early on with phase one, which is a very finite. It's like, all right, we have this many hostages, this many prisoners, like we have to do this. Like, it was hard, don't get me wrong, stopping the war, and it was very hard. It was very well defined. It was very tangible what success looks like. We can deploy a business mindset to make a deal. Deal making, however, for something that's a lot broader, a lot more complex, I worry that will potentially empower the wrong players and sideline the necessary ones, aka Qatar and Turkey, at the expense of Saudi and the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah. So before we got quite a few questions. One last before I get to the questions from our audience. Can you define for us what is radical pragmatism, and how do Realign for Palestine apply this viewpoint of radical pragmatism?
Certainly. So to me, I mean, there's actually like a whole kind of philosophical movement behind radical pragmatism, but I'm not going to get into that. I distill it to a very simple set of ideas and principles, which is that what is possible, what is achievable, what is a kind of known fact and a known outcome, and how do you work backwards to optimize for this known fact and known outcome. So we know that millions of Jewish Israelis and millions of Palestinians are here to stay. We know Israel, you can speak all you want about history, all you want about Zionism, all you want about the slogans and the rhetoric and the this and the that. But Israel is here. Israel is a diverse nation. Israel has a lot to offer the world, just like it has a lot of problems. And quite frankly, some of its past has entailed some really, I think, problematic and terrible injustices done onto the Palestinians. Likewise, the Palestinians, I think they have had missed opportunities. They have had terrible leadership, the Arab interference. There's been some manipulation of some historical aspects, etc. Fine, we can talk about that at some point, but we're both here to stay. There's layers of what do we do with that? At minimum, there is like, we need to just acknowledge that we're both here to stay. And so some degree of separation is necessary. Then there will be people that say, actually, we need to have separation, but where appropriate, we need to have cooperation. Then some people are like, no, we need to have coexistence, and yes, separate, but actually be able to interact and be close together. Then there are people who are like, no, we need to be like fully integrated together and be one, and use our Abrahamic roots and use our faiths that are closer together and build lasting partnerships and benefit off of each other. And Israel can benefit from the labor force of the Palestinians. The Palestinians can benefit from the advancements of Israel in 1, 2, 3. So there's tiers of radical pragmatism. Radical pragmatism is realizing that we've done armed resistance with pan-Arabism, and then the PLO's secular nationalism, and then the PFLP's Marxist communism, and then we've done it now with Hamas's Islamism, and the outcome is the same. We keep losing more land, more opportunities, and more of our people. So radical pragmatism is saying, oops, radical, like armed resistance is not effective. And marching down the streets of New York and Washington and Boston and San Francisco and saying, we want armed resistance and long live October 7th, maybe that's a bad slogan to adopt for the Palestinian people. Radical pragmatism is acknowledging that there are multiple truths, that I can have grievances towards the state of Israel. I can have issues towards past historical and contemporary occurrences. But at the same time, I can also acknowledge that Hamas is a disaster. I can acknowledge Arab and Palestinian leadership failure. I can acknowledge that we've acquiesced to certain narratives. I can acknowledge that the Jewish people belong. The Jewish people have heritage and connection to the land, and that doesn't cancel out the memories of my grandparents who lived in Zarnuga outside of Rehovot, and were pushed out in 1948. Like, there is capacity for holding multiple things at the same time without them being in eternal opposition. And that's not kumbaya. That is actually the height of emotional intelligence that produces sound underpinning and framing for effect. So to me, there is the recognition of what is possible, what is attainable, what are the limits of the Palestinian people, and then you use that as a starting point to actually build from simply tolerance to embrace to acceptance, to like joint cooperation and living. And it's, so we don't need all Palestinians or all Israelis to fall in love to achieve peace or to achieve, that can happen in generations. That the baggage can be undone over time. What we need is a radically pragmatic set of leaders and set of principles that can link the two together and find the slightest of common ground that can grow and expand over time, rather than sloganeering, rhetoric, ideological insanity, and extremism. So radical extremism or radical pragmatism, you choose.
So in that vein, this might sound a bit out of our conversation, but can you please just clarify the poster behind you that we only see the word violence, but I'm pretty sure there's something else
Oh yeah, it says
in that poster.
says
And the
end the
violence.
violence, start the
Great.
future. End the
Yes.
violence, start the future. You never every Zoom cuts out funny and a lot of times people tell me to adjust the camera. I was in a session earlier. I was in an interview earlier and they asked me to adjust the session. But
Yeah.
yes, end the violence.
And the violence. Yeah, just to clarify this. Great. So I'm gonna go to some of the questions, and I'm gonna try to put some different questions together. Um, how do we go about the disarmament of Hamas? If and you've mentioned that so many different actors are hesitant, and we've seen 2 years of Israel attempting to do that, notwithstanding the fact that there were hostages. How do we get there?
Well, I mean, there's endless threads that need to come together to make this happen. I would say some of that is some of it you can, the carrot or stick approach. Some of it is you provide incentives. Hamas is paying an estimated $25 a day to a lot of its fighters right now.
Mhm.
And so is it a matter of just for some of these fighters, you might be able to just get them to abandon ship if you can provide them with an alternative. Some of them are ideological. And so there will have to, and some of them are very insane and hardline, and like you will actually have to take them on. And so you divide and strategize accordingly. There's and this is similar to how I engage the public. There is engage, convince, and confront. Um, but I do believe the idea isn't to get rid of, like, 80 years on, or some, I think it's 80 years on, there are still be people that believe in Nazi ideology. There's still people now, what, 20 years, 20 something, some odd years after 9/11, that believe in Al Qaeda's and bin Laden's ideology. The issue isn't so much to remove thoughts out of people's heads as much as we want to optimize for better thoughts and for different trajectories. The issue is to ensure that they don't have access to the tools and the means for undermining stability, for threatening life, and for creating damage and havoc. And by the way, that damage often begins from within. By the time it reaches the outside world, it has already inflicted so much internal damage. So I say that we need to accept that there will have to be a confrontation of some sort against elements of what remains of Hamas. And then you can offer some possible amnesty, you can offer some possible off ramp. But even that you have to be really careful with, because I don't know. I don't trust the brainwashing of Hamas. And I don't believe that we need to kill every single one of them. That's not what success looks like. But can we have a force that is larger than Hamas? Can we have a social contract and a societal infrastructure for accommodating different elements of the Palestinian people who are at different stages of their ideological training or belonging? And then finally, can we address the grievances with Israel through the prism of diplomatic, political horizon without without normalizing the idea that somehow violence is actually going to yield any results or any benefits to the Palestinian people? And then you want to go a step further. And this is the part that I care about the most, is to just start speaking openly to a large Palestinian audience to normalize peace. Like I want to say that, your live peace and de-radicalization, framing them as something that's positive. That usually they're mentioned in a security context. Usually they're mentioned in a counterterrorism context. And usually there's an element of like, oh, you radical thing, I'm going to come here and I'm going to de-radicalize you kind of thing. But for me, I want to figure out a way to message de-radicalization differently, where it's empowering, it's improving your life, it's uplifting you, it's giving you options, it's giving you a way out, it's connecting you to the outside world. Something like 70, I think I've shared this number already, but up to 75% of Gaza's population have never been outside of Gaza. And so connecting people outside of to the outside world, along with economic empowerment, the totality of those things. And yes, of course, addressing indoctrination at mosques and that were run by Hamas, surgically removing problematic elements of curriculum. Absolutely, those are necessary steps. But it's a toolbox. It's a toolbox rather than a magic wand, if you will.
It also touches, I think your answer also touches what you mentioned before about a consciousness of victimhood versus agency, and it really all threads together. How do you see the relationship between Gaza and the West Bank? In both, you mentioned what you mentioned about Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and also when you're thinking about the nation building.
So, I mean, this has been a frustrating issue for me for many years, in the sense that there is this folly approach that believes there's going to be a central government, a central state that governs Gaza and governs the West Bank. I don't believe that's feasible. I believe there needs to be the state of Palestine as a federal entity, a federal model, but Gaza administratively, economically needs to be somewhat independent from the West Bank. It needs to be a mini statelet. It's kind of like expecting California and Texas to merge and to be run by the same government. Now, they're under the auspices of the United States, but they're totally separate entities. Gaza, culturally, is very different than the West Bank. There are microcultures within Gaza and microcultures in the West Bank. I mean, even people in Nablus in northern West Bank are very different than people in Khalil, in Hebron in the south, and people in Beit Lahem, and people in Ramallah. And so acknowledging those differences is not, divisive. It's actually like, strength across our diversity is I think something that could be an effective strategy. And so Gaza overlooks the Mediterranean. Gaza, I think, can and should have an airport and a seaport. Gaza, I believe, should be linked to the Saudi Arabia and to the Gulf through, as part of the expansion of the Abraham Accords and Saudi-Israeli normalization and IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, through Israel, through Jordan, through in a corridor. And I have that, I've been promoting that for a while, like a corridor that has rail, that has fiber optics, and that has an oil pipeline to connect Saudi and Emirati oil exports to Gaza, and then Gaza exports to Europe. That's one way to generate revenue. Of course, it's never going to replace the Suez Canal, but when you have the instability in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait with Iran, in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait with the Houthis and the Strait of Hormuz with Iran, a gentle alternative would be quite welcome. And so I strongly believe that there needs to be acknowledged and normalized separation between two, not to divide them and permanently sever the ties, but to embrace their unique differences and allow for both peoples to choose and to kind of choose what kind of a society and system they want to live under.
Yeah. A different question here speaks about strategy. And also, so I'll take maybe two together. So one part of this is can you reflect for us on your voice basically, or your activity, and how you see yourself? Are you an activist? Are you something else? How do you see and what would you expect of others to be? Others, whether you mentioned the Palestinian diaspora, but also, and you mentioned the pro-Palestinian movement, people who care about the future of the conflict, how would you want them to raise their voices? And then also people are asking how can Jews in the diaspora or Israelis can support the things that you are speaking about, and your work in general.
Certainly. And what's difficult here is that, I mean, I acknowledge that I have not only do I have a quite an unusual background, though I maintain that there are many Ahmeds out there that express themselves differently. They might just say threads of what I'm saying. They might be quiet. They might be afraid. They might not speak English. They might whatever. But like, I don't want the takeaway, because people often think that, and I'm not alone. Like, I might be alone in how loud and outspoken I am, but I'm not alone. Nevertheless, I acknowledge that the way I've gone about this is different than how a lot of people have chosen to do it. And there have been times when I've leaned more into the engage and convince. There have been times when I wanted to inspire. There have been times when I was very heavy on the confrontation. There have been times when I call people out, and I am very ruthlessly consistent in calling people out when not for petty internet disagreements, but when I feel that they're really undermining the prospects of the Palestinian people, the idea, the hopes for a resurgence, a renaissance, a rejuvenation. Everybody just talks about reconstruction. I don't want to just reconstruct Gaza. I want to rejuvenate it. I want to reconstitute it. I want something else. And so one of I mean, the way I look at it is that there really are three separate realms that exist for a lot of this work. There's the activism realm, and that's very grassroots. That's very kind of on the ground. A lot of the brute work, or the grunt work, I should say. Uh, uh, um, and some of that is very effective and transformative. Some of that ends up leading to substantial changes. Some of that, I think, can also be incredibly performative, incredibly destructive, massively harmful, and very unhelpful, and very, very unhelpful, and very detrimental, rather. So then above that, there's the realm of advocacy. So there's activism, and then there's advocacy. And for me, advocacy is about recognizing that you're a step up from activism. And I'm not saying you're better than activists. It's just you're in a different realm. I'm not putting you on a social hierarchy. That's not my intention. But you're a step up from activism in that you actually have to formulate specific policies. You have to be very careful about the words you choose. You are interacting with the next realm beyond this, which is policy and decision makers. So you have activism, advocacy, and policy makers and decision makers. And I see myself as being an advocate, someone who is in the middle as far as picking up from a lot of activism that is happening, doing things that people that intersect with activism, but using words, using strategies, using, the way that you promulgate your opinions, focusing on some decision makers, focusing on specific target audiences that are helpful for the message, that are helpful for achieving breakthroughs, to make it up there with the policymakers who, the thing about policymakers or decision or the policy realm, it's harder to get in. They tend to be detached from a lot of the activists, or they tend to have a lot of firewalls. They tend to be detached from a lot of the communities that are involved in the different issues. And so it's important to understand where you're at. Are you an activist? Are you an advocate? Or are you in policy realm? And are you trying to, what is your goal? Are you working on a specific issue? Do you want to graduate to advocacy or graduate from advocacy to policy? Are you going to jump from being an activist to going, some people do that, to going fully into policy? And then the way that I like to frame, to simplify it, to oversimplify it, is to say, do you want to make a point or do you want to make a difference? Because that ultimately guides where you're at in these three realms, how you navigate across these three realms, and the strategies that you choose. Do you write an op-ed for the school newspaper and you use revolutionary zeal as the guiding principle, and then 10 years later you're in Congress and that's discovered or that's read in an embarrassing way and you're like, oh, I don't know what to do? Or do you want to be writing op-eds for different papers? Do you want to be organizing specific constituencies? Are you targeting everybody? Do you want to grow a social media audience? Social media now is the court of public opinion, for better or for worse, by the way. It's not always wonderful. Often it's not, but you can actually skillfully, I would say social media helped me become part of who I am. So do you want to use traditional means of getting to politicians? Do you see yourself as using this as a stepping stone? Are you just doing this because you want community and you want to connect with other people? I mean, that is a valid thing that a lot of people consciously and subconsciously like that's why they're involved in a lot of activism. So I would say thinking about it in terms of those three realms has helped me and some of those around me in picking our strategies and proceeding accordingly.
And how would you say, if people ask you, which they did, how can people, that are sitting right now watching at the screen, be of help to the vision that you're describing? What would be your answer?
Well, I mean, this is always something that comes up at the end of different conversations, and I certainly appreciate and we need allies across our communities. The challenge is that folks who are like-minded, it's going to be difficult to stand out amidst the extremes that are now so popular, that are now so prominent and dominant in the discourse. It's now going to be really, really exceptionally difficult to, getting on social media and saying Israel 1, 2, 3, 4, bah, and getting, hundreds of thousands of likes, impressions, retweets, whatever. There's a feedback loop. People get in, it's intoxicating to get validation online. And then the Wall Street Journal publishes your piece and you're saying, this is hopeless and we're going to destroy, there's different iterations of that. So I would say find a niche within this big, wide realm. Is it the humanitarian work? Is it policy issues? Is it the settlements? To be clear, I speak with a ton of mainstream Jewish allies, and there are challenges within the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community and the self-identified Zionist spaces that, you know, there might not be a one-for-one comparison with the pro-Palestine or the Arab or Muslim or Palestinian American communities, but there's also rising extremism and intensity and nationalism and support for violence and the trends towards dehumanization. And so again, it might not be a one-for-one comparison, but there are common trends across the two communities of dehumanization, of radicalization, of zero-sum thinking. So I would say, first of all, identify your philosophical, moral or ethical or political underpinning, your principles, your code of conduct, your scaffolding. What are you? Are you a radical pragmatist? Are you an idealist? Are you nonviolent? Do you believe in violence in a specific manner? Do you believe? And that's fine. By the like, I'm not a pacifist. I prefer nonviolence, but I'm not a pacifist. I do believe you have to use violence in precise applications, but I don't. The problem is, you know, once you open the floodgates of violence, then all those people that decide, well, you know, Zionism is Nazism, so I'm going to punch a Zionist, you know, and then they do that at UC Berkeley, and then things spiral out of control. So like, that's not what I mean. What I mean is in statecraft. I'm talking strictly in statecraft. There are very precise, narrow applications of violence. Anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked there. So decide your underpinning. Decide what you are and who you are. Number two is find a niche within this space. What do you want to actually do? Like, do you want to change policy? Do you want to seek community? Do you want to make friends? Do you want to be an ally? Do you want to grow your community? Do you want to become a politician? Do you want to make money off of this issue? There are entrepreneurs. I've met a ton of people throughout the war who've pitched me immense products, particularly, I mean, including some Jewish Israelis and folks, Jewish allies in here who are motivated by pro-peace sentiments, and they've developed sentiment monitors that are very geo-fenced and geo-specific to be able to figure out how to read sentiments, like where is the activity. They use AI, they use Google data, they use blah, 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 blah. What's the sentiment in California? What's the sentiment in parts of Gaza? What's the sentiment in parts of Israel based on internet traffic? Where is the activity, etc.? So like, you could be like a peace entrepreneur or like a social entrepreneur if you want. So decide what you want. And then finally, decide how you're going to last in a space that is very easy to get burnt out in, and it's very easy to get demoralized. It's very easy. So either set a time frame. Are you going to try this for some time? Are you going to be in it and khalas, that's it? Are you going to back out and do XYZ if this doesn't work out? Because I've met way too many people that get involved and they burn out. And I have 5 fingers pointing back at me. Believe me, every day is a struggle. I wanna walk away from this discourse. And then finally, I do like promulgate optimism, hope, and a willingness to engage no matter what, because people need some. And I'm not saying it's your job to make people feel better, but I think all of us collectively can be part of this bigger jigsaw puzzle. To actually inspire all of us to stay engaged with this. So give to peace organizations, give to humanitarian organizations, organize local drives that or give 50-50 to some organization that's giving to hostage families or to families in Gaza or kibbutzim survivors, or like just even gestures like that. They might sound minuscule and some people might mock them and be like, oh yeah, you're just trying to make people feel better. And also don't hold back in speaking out. I mean, you can be pro-Israel. The same radical pragmatism that I said to you, and I'll really close with this, exists for you as a Jewish American, as a Jewish Israeli, as a self-identified Zionist. You can be all of the aforementioned and proudly for believing in Israel, even if you disagree with the government, blah, blah, blah. But like, if you see settler violence in the West Bank that is horrendous, you can speak out. You can do your part. So all of us have a component to play in this, and I hope you don't shy away from finding your niche and proceeding accordingly.
I think it's beautiful to end in a way that is really, really emphasizing engagement in a radically pragmatic way, which is such a, I think, an excellent way to summarize this conversation. Ahmed, thank you so much. This has been rich and meaningful, and at the end, also, I think, hopeful and optimistic, but also calling for us, calling on us to at least in each of us in our spheres of our life to be engaged as much as possible and not be apathetic. So thank you so much for this conversation. And
Thank you.
Rebecca, back to
I,
you.
I just want to thank you both. Thank you, Masua. Thank you, Ahmed, for this conversation. I realize that it's an arbitrary cutoff and that you could have continued for another hour or more. And we did not even cover all of the questions that were directed your way. But I think we'll have future opportunities to continue the conversation. And I want to thank you both for being here and thank everybody who joined today.
Thank you. Inshallah.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye. Good
Bye.
night.